My brother-in-law called me a beggar at dinner, sneering for everyone to hear. Little did he know I'd been secretly paying his debts for months, and the moment I stopped, his whole facade began to crumble. Ugh, where do I even begin? I'm Patricia, 45, and I own this little bakery here in Cordoba, Argentina. It's my life, my passion, the smell of fresh media lunas at 4 a.m., the warmth of the oven on a chilly morning. It's real, you know? Unlike a lot of things in my husband's family. We live in this beautiful, leafy residential neighborhood, the kind with jacaranda trees that explode with purple in spring, and bougainvillea climbing over high walls. It looks idyllic, right? And it is, mostly. But underneath all that beauty, there's this constant hum of pressure. Every Saturday or Sunday, without fail, it's an asado at someone's house, usually my MLs. And these aren't just casual get-togethers with good food and laughs. Oh no. These are full-blown performances, a ritual where the clinking of glasses and the sizzle of meat on the perilla are just background noise to the real show. Appearances, Reddit, are everything here. From the brand of car you drive, and God forbid it's not European or new or even worse used, to the shoes on your feet, the designer handbags perched just so, the lavish vacations your kids just took, the private schools they attend. People don't just talk. They brag. Loudly. They brag about their kids' latest achievements, their new investments, their connections to important people. It's like a never-ending social Olympics, and if you're not winning, or at least looking like you're winning, you're invisible. Or worse, a pity case, someone to be quietly dissected and judged. You can feel the unspoken competition in the air, thick as the smoke from the grill, and it makes my chest feel tight. My husband's family, bless their hearts, are the undisputed champions of this game. They have this almost pathological obsession with looking effortlessly successful, as if money just flows into their hands like water from a natural spring. They'll talk about the market or our portfolio with this air of casual superiority, a slight tilt of the head, as if they've cracked some secret code to wealth that the rest of us mere mortals just haven't figured out yet. It's all about maintaining this pristine, untouchable image of prosperity. Any wrinkle in that facade is a catastrophic failure, a personal affront to their very existence. And then there's Oscar, my husband's younger brother, my BIL. He's the poster child for this whole charade. He drives a gleaming black Mercedes-Benz C-Class, always has the latest iPhone model before it's even officially released here, talks about his upcoming big deal in real estate with a vague, knowing smile, and takes these ridiculously extravagant trips to Brazil or Uruguay with his buddies. You'd think he was some kind of self-made millionaire, the way he carries himself. Chest puffed out, a permanent smirk playing on his lips like he knows something you don't. Something better. Richer. Problem is, I know his lavish lifestyle is almost entirely built on credit. He's a house of cards, constantly on the verge of toppling, one strong gust of wind away from crashing down. But to everyone else, he's living the dream, the family's golden boy. His wife, my SIL, is just as bad, honestly. If not worse, because her attacks are so insidious. She's got this knack for making you feel like you're constantly falling short without ever saying anything outright. She'll comment on my bakery, "Oh, Patricia, how quaint. So nice you have your little hobby to keep you busy." The word little always hangs in the air, heavy with unspoken judgment. Or she'll subtly remind my husband and me that we barely made it into their esteemed social circle, as if we're this charity case they graciously accepted. She'll lift a perfectly sculpted eyebrow when I mention investing in a new industrial oven for the bakery, but gush over Oscar's new bespoke suit or the limited edition watch he just acquired. It's infuriating, truly, this constant drip-drip of condescension. You feel it in your gut, that subtle dig, that dismissive glance that says, "You're not one of us, not really, not truly successful." And I swear, sometimes I just want to scream, but you learn to just smile and nod, because that's what you do to keep the peace in this family. It's exhausting, trying to keep up with their endless charade, especially when you know what's really simmering beneath the surface. My own hands, calloused from kneading dough, feel alien next to their perfectly manicured ones, and it makes my blood boil. But here's the thing, Reddit. The gleaming facade, the expensive car, the lavish trips. It was all a house of cards constantly on the verge of collapsing. Oscar has always lived beyond his means, always chasing the next big thing, the next flashy purchase, convinced he's just one deal away from true wealth. And for years, these short-term crises, as he so casually called them, would pop up like weeds. A sudden issue with his car, a misunderstanding with a major bill, a delay in payment from a client that somehow always coincided with his credit card being maxed out. My husband, bless his naive heart, would sometimes try to help, dipping into our savings, always believing Oscar's promises of next month for sure. But it was never next month. About 6 months ago, things got serious. Oscar had spiraled. He'd maxed out multiple credit cards, taken out a couple of personal loans he couldn't service, and the interest rates were just swallowing him whole. He confessed to my husband, in a tearful, panicked phone call, that debt collectors were starting to call his home. Not just him, but his parents' home too, because of some shared financial history from a past venture. My Mill and Phil, oblivious to the true extent of his recklessness, would have absolutely imploded if they knew. Their perfect son, the golden boy, being hounded by debt collectors. It would shatter their carefully constructed illusion of effortless prosperity, and that in their world is a fate worse than death. My husband came to me, pale and desperate. He knew we couldn't afford to bail Oscar out entirely without jeopardizing our own bakery's future, but he was terrified of the family scandal. He begged me, not for money directly, but for help navigating Oscar's mess. That's how I got involved. Initially, I just helped structure a payment plan, thinking I'd just be advising. But then, to prevent those dreaded calls and notices from reaching my in-laws' pristine home, I quietly, almost secretly, began to act as an intermediary, making direct payments to Oscar's credit card arrears myself from my own bakery's overflow. I would log into my online banking in the quiet hours after midnight, the blue light of the screen illuminating my tired face, and transfer amounts that felt like a punch to the gut. Each click of the mouse authorizing a payment to some faceless bank on his behalf felt like a piece of my soul chipped away. I did it not for him, not for the ungrateful, arrogant man who looked down on my little bakery. I did it to protect my in-laws, to preserve the fragile peace that my husband so desperately clung to. I saw the fear in my husband's eyes, the way he flinched at the thought of his parents' judgment. I knew how much their image meant to them, how much shame it would bring if the truth about Oscar's financial recklessness came out. So, I swallowed it. I swallowed the bile that rose in my throat every time I saw Oscar flaunting his wealth. For 6 agonizing months, this became my hidden burden. I stayed late at the bakery, taking on extra orders, pushing myself to the limit to cover his favors. My hands, usually soothed by the rhythmic kneading of dough, started to ache from the constant work, the exhaustion becoming a permanent resident behind my eyes. I'd listen to Oscar's empty promises to pay me back next month, delivered with a casual wave of his hand and that infuriating smirk. He'd say things like, "You know how it is, Pat, just a temporary cash flow thing. My big deal is just around the corner." And I'd just nod, forcing a thin smile, feeling the silent resentment festering inside me like a slow-burning fire. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. While he was out there pretending to be a millionaire, I, the beggar who just sold bread and cakes, was the one quietly bailing his privileged ass out, preventing his entire elaborate charade from crumbling down around his family's perfect ears. Every time I saw his new watch or heard about his latest extravagant weekend, the frustration would boil, hot and sharp, but I kept it locked away, for the sake of family. It was exhausting, utterly soul-crushing, and I felt like I was drowning in his debt, silently suffocating under the weight of his lies and my own unwilling complicity. The next family dinner felt like any other. It was at my Emil's, of course, a Saturday night asado that had stretched into the cooler hours, the kind where the air was thick with the scent of grilled meat, expensive Malbec, and the clatter of cutlery against porcelain. The long, polished dining table was laden with platters of leftover entraña and vacío, salads overflowing with fresh greens, and an array of desserts that always seemed to appear magically. Candles flickered, casting a warm, deceptive glow over everyone's faces. 2 bottles of the good red wine had already been emptied, and a third was making the rounds, loosening tongues and lowering inhibitions. I usually love these moments. The warmth, the shared laughter, the feeling of connection. But tonight, there was an edge to it, a subtle undercurrent of tension that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I should have known. Oscar, predictably, was already a few glasses in, his face flushed, his usually guarded smirk now more pronounced, almost a sneer. He was in full bragging mode, recounting some elaborate story about a lucrative venture he was supposedly closing, puffing up his chest as he gestured wildly with his wine glass. My Esiel, perched elegantly beside him, occasionally interjected with a perfectly timed, "Oh, darling, you're too modest," or a knowing glance around the table as if to say, "See, we told you he was destined for greatness." I just kept my gaze fixed on my plate, trying to make small talk with my husband's cousin about her kids' school, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest. The conversations around the table were getting louder, more boisterous, less filtered. And then, as if on cue, the conversation veered towards us. Oscar, catching my eye across the table, or perhaps deliberately seeking it out, I don't know, leaned forward, his voice a little too loud, dripping with feigned joviality. He started making these thinly veiled jokes, the kind that weren't really jokes at all, but pointed jabs disguised as playful banter. "You know," he slurred slightly, a glint in his eye. "My brother, he always had a soft spot for the simpler things in life. Who needs a high-flying career when you can have the smell of fresh bread every morning, eh, Patricia?" He punctuated it with a loud, forced laugh, and a few nervous chuckles rippled around the table. My face felt hot, a flush creeping up my neck. I could feel my jaw clench, a familiar knot forming in my stomach. It was the married down implication, the subtle reminder that I just sell bread and cakes, not real estate or investments. My husband, sitting beside me, shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat, but said nothing. He just squeezed my knee under the table, a silent plea for me to ignore it, to keep the peace. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to calm the anger that was already starting to simmer. But Oscar wasn't done. He seemed to relish the discomfort he was creating. The topic drifted, as it always did, to money, to financial security, to building a legacy. And that's when he struck. He leaned back in his chair, a smug, superior look plastered across his face, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He caught my eye again, and this time, there was no mistaking the malice behind his smile. "Look, at the end of the day," he declared, his voice cutting through the general chatter, loud enough for everyone to hear, "some of us build real wealth. We make smart investments, we take risks, we create something substantial. Others," and his gaze lingered on me for just a beat too long, "others just beg the bank or relatives to survive." The words hit me like a physical blow. Beg the bank or relatives to survive. My breath caught in my throat. My fork, which I'd been idly twirling, clattered loudly against my plate, the sound echoing in the sudden, crushing silence that descended upon the table. The nervous chuckles that had greeted his earlier joke died instantly, replaced by an unbearable stillness. I felt the searing heat of humiliation flood my face, my ears burning, a throbbing pulse starting behind my eyes. It wasn't just the insult. It was the absolute gut-wrenching irony of it all. Here he was, this entitled, arrogant man, sitting across from me, sneering about begging, while for the past 6 months I had been the relative, quietly bailing him out, preventing his entire house of cards from collapsing. My money, earned with aching hands and sleepless nights in my little bakery, was the only thing keeping his real wealth facade intact. I looked around the table, a desperate, silent plea in my eyes. My Mill was looking down at her plate, meticulously cutting a piece of meat. My FIL pretended to be engrossed in a conversation with my SIL about a new wine, though his voice was a little too loud, a little too forced. My husband beside me had gone completely still. His hand was still on my knee, but he wasn't squeezing it anymore. It felt like a dead weight. His eyes were fixed on the tablecloth, his jaw tight. He wouldn't look at me. No one spoke. No one defended me. No one even acknowledged the truth or the lie. They just sat there, frozen, complicit in their silence, letting his words hang in the air like a poisonous cloud. In that moment, surrounded by family, I felt utterly, completely alone. It wasn't just a dinner, it was an execution, and I was tied to the stake. The burning rage, the humiliation, the profound sense of betrayal, it all coalesced into a cold, hard lump in my gut. I wanted to scream, to stand up, to rip apart his carefully constructed lies right there and then, to list every single peso I'd covered, every desperate message he'd sent. But I couldn't. I just sat there, a forced, brittle smile glued to my face, my vision blurring slightly, the delicious food on my plate suddenly tasting like ash. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that something inside me had irrevocably broken. The silence. Read it. It was a physical thing, pressing down on me, stealing the air from my lungs. My face felt like it was on fire, a deep, painful blush that started at my chest and crept all the way up to my hairline, making my ears throb. Every nerve ending felt raw, exposed. All I could hear was the frantic thumping of my own heart against my ribs, a drumbeat of pure, unadulterated humiliation. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up, to overturn the table, to rip apart his carefully constructed lies right there in front of everyone. The words were forming on my tongue, a torrent of dates and amounts, every single peso I'd transferred, every desperate message he'd sent begging for, just this once, Pat, I promise, every empty promise to repay. I could picture the stunned faces, the way their meticulously maintained facades would crack, the shock in my Mill's eyes as her golden boy's glittering image shattered into a million pieces right before her. Oh, how I yearned to do it. The urge was so overwhelming it felt like a physical pain, a burning acid in my throat. But then, my husband's hand, which had been a dead weight on my knee, subtly tightened. Just a slight, almost imperceptible squeeze. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was a desperate plea, a silent, urgent command. Don't, Pat. Don't make a scene. Don't ruin it. His eyes were still fixed on the tablecloth, but I could feel the weight of his silent expectation, the implicit understanding that I was the one who needed to keep the peace, to swallow the insult, to not be that person who brought down the family harmony. And in that moment, I was trapped. Trapped between my burning pride, my gut-wrenching need for justice, and his desperate desire to avoid a family war. The thought of being the one to destroy the family peace, to expose their precious illusion of perfection, was a heavy burden, one I knew he couldn't bear. So, I forced a brittle, unnatural smile onto my face, a grimace that probably looked more like I was in pain than amused. I took a shaky breath, the air still thick with Oscar's cutting words, and kept my mouth shut. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable and suffocating, until someone, finally, mercifully, cleared their throat and redirected the conversation to something innocuous about the weather. But the damage was done. My soul felt bruised, battered, and utterly, profoundly alone. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced politeness and strained smiles. I mostly just picked at my food, the taste of ash still coating my tongue. My head was pounding, a dull ache behind my eyes. I felt like a ghost moving through the bustling house, the laughter and chatter around me sounding distant, muffled. I just wanted to go home, to lock myself away from all of it. As the night wound down and people started gathering their things, saying their goodbyes, I found myself near the kitchen, helping my Sil clear a few plates. My back was to the living room when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I flinched, turning to see Oscar, his face still flushed from the wine, a little unsteady on his feet, but his smirk was back in full force. He leaned in conspiratorially, his breath smelling faintly of Malbec and cheap arrogance. "Hey, Pat," he slurred, his voice low as if sharing a secret, but with that familiar entitlement dripping from every syllable. "By the way, I'll need another little favor this month. You know how it is. Just a small glitch, a delay in some funds coming through. Nothing major, just a little something to tide me over until my big deal closes next week. You're generous, right?" He winked, completely oblivious, completely unashamed, as if asking me to cover his significant debts was as casual as asking for a glass of water. as if my generosity was simply an endless expected resource for him to tap into, a part of his lavish lifestyle that he was entitled to. And that was it. That was the moment. It wasn't the insult at dinner, not really. That had just been the spark. This casual, audacious, utterly shameless expectation, right after he'd publicly humiliated me, was the explosion. Something inside me, something that had been burning with rage and humiliation just moments before, went utterly, completely cold. It wasn't anger anymore. It was an icy, unwavering resolve. It was like a switch flipped, from boiling frustration to absolute unfeeling clarity. My heart, which had been pounding, suddenly felt still, quiet. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, I saw not just the entitled Bill, but a leech, a parasite, utterly devoid of self-awareness or gratitude. My quiet support, my silent resentment, my husband's plea for peace, it had all just become part of his expected routine. He didn't see me as a person helping him. He saw me as a means to an end, a convenient, easily manipulated ATM for his fake life. A strange, almost serene calm settled over me. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips, but it didn't reach my eyes. My voice when it came was steady, almost chillingly so. "Of course, Oscar," I said, meeting his gaze directly, a quiet promise in my tone that he completely missed. Of course. But as I said those words, something deep within me whispered, "No more. Not one more peso. Not one more second of my peace for your charade." The decision was made. It was cold, hard, and absolutely final. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I knew it was going to shatter everything. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't exhaustion or resentment, but a dangerous, exhilarating sense of purpose. "Of course, Oscar," I'd said, the words slipping out like silk, a quiet promise he completely misinterpreted. But inside, something had irrevocably shifted. It wasn't anger anymore, not the searing, burning kind that had flushed my face at dinner. This was something colder, sharper, a steel trap snapping shut around a decision made in absolute, chilling clarity. My smile, I knew, didn't reach my eyes. It was a mask, a polite veneer over a brand new, dangerous resolve. I felt strangely calm, almost serene, as if a great weight had been lifted the moment I uttered that lie. The drive home with my husband was silent, thick with unspoken tension. He kept glancing at me, a worried furrow in his brow, but he didn't say a word. Didn't try to apologize for Oscar, didn't even acknowledge what had happened. His silence felt like a betrayal, an affirmation that keeping the peace, protecting the family's fragile image, was more important than my dignity. But I barely registered it. My mind was already racing, meticulously planning. The hum of the engine, the familiar streetlights passing by, all faded into a backdrop for the quiet revolution brewing inside me. The moment we walked through our front door, I moved with a purpose I hadn't felt in months. My husband went straight to bed, probably hoping to sleep off the evening's discomfort. I, however, went to my small home office, the one I usually used for bakery accounts. The house was quiet. The only sounds the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall and the distant chirping of crickets. It was past midnight, the perfect time for a quiet execution. My hands, which usually smelled of flour and vanilla, now felt steady, almost surgical, as I reached for my phone. The screen light felt harsh in the dim room, but I welcomed its cold illumination. I pulled up the contact for the bank where Oscar had his consolidation plan, the one I'd been quietly propping up. I knew the specific department, the specific extension, the specific details. I remembered the first time I'd called them, 6 months ago, my stomach in knots, feeling like a criminal just for trying to help. This time there was no knot, just a detached resolve. I explained to the late-night customer service representative in calm, measured tones that I needed to revoke my authorization for any and all transactions related to Oscar's accounts. I stated clearly that I would no longer be responsible for any payments, guarantees, or communications on his behalf. The representative, a professional voice on the other end, sounded a little surprised, but confirmed my request. There was a brief pause, a whirring of computer systems, and then, "Understood, Ms. Rossi. All authorizations have been removed. All future communication regarding Mr. Solis's accounts will be directed solely to him." The words were like music to my ears, a clear, definitive severance. I felt a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor of satisfaction run through me. The click of the phone as I hung up echoed in the quiet room, a sound of finality. Next, I opened my email. I found the contact for the debt collection agency that had been hounding Oscar before I stepped in. I composed a concise, formal email stating that I was no longer acting as an intermediary or guarantor for Oscar Solis. I redirected all future communication, payment requests, and legal notices directly to his personal email and his registered home address. I hit send without a moment's hesitation, watching the email disappear into the digital ether. My fingers, usually sore from kneading, felt light and free. The air in the room, which had always felt heavy with Oscar's unspoken demands, suddenly felt lighter, easier to breathe. Then came the waiting. The first few days were strangely quiet. Oscar predictably called me the next morning, breezy and entitled. "Hey, Pat, just a reminder about that little favor, for the end of the month." I kept my voice calm. "Don't worry, Oscar. I'll take care of it." A lie, but a necessary one to give him just enough rope. I could almost hear the smirk in his voice as he thanked me, completely oblivious to the trap I'd just sprung. Weeks passed, and initially there was nothing. The calm before the storm was almost unnerving. I'd wake up in the morning, the smell of fresh dough comforting me, and almost wonder if I'd dreamed it all. But then, slowly, subtly, the cracks began to appear. The first sign wasn't a phone call, but a physical one. My mill, during one of our mandatory Sunday asados, looked flustered. She held up a plain, official-looking envelope, her manicured fingers trembling slightly. "Oscar, darling," she said, her voice laced with concern. Another one of these strange letters arrived. "It's from the bank. Says urgent attention required. Is everything all right with your investments?" Oscar, still trying to maintain his golden boy facade, snatched the letter from her hand, his face paling slightly. "Oh, that?" he scoffed, forcing a laugh. "Just some administrative error, Mama. My bank is always messing things up. Don't worry your pretty head about it." He crumpled the envelope, tossing it carelessly onto the side table, but I caught the quick, furtive glance he shot in my direction. He knew, or at least he suspected. A few days later, another letter arrived, this time from a different bank, and then a third from a collection agency. The envelopes were plain, but their contents were anything but. They were addressed directly to Oscar, but because his registered address was still sometimes linked to my in-laws' house due to an old business venture, they started arriving there. My mill, usually so composed, was visibly agitated. "Oscar, this is getting ridiculous. What are these errors? It says past due and legal action." Her voice was high-pitched, bordering on panic. The carefully maintained illusion of effortless wealth was starting to fray around the edges, and the stress lines around her mouth deepened. Oscar's stories grew increasingly desperate and outlandish. He tried to spin tales of jealous ex-partners somehow sabotaging his finances, or fake charges from a new, shady online venture. He even tried to blame some system glitch with the bank, saying, "My money is just stuck. You know how it is, Pat. They're so inefficient." He'd look at me, a desperate plea in his eyes now, no longer the arrogant smirk expecting me to back him up to somehow fix it. But I just nodded, offering vague, non-committal noises of sympathy, my face a mask of feigned concern. I watched him squirm, watched his meticulously crafted facade wobble and crack under the pressure, and a quiet, grim satisfaction settled deep in my bones. He was digging his own grave, completely unaware that I wasn't just letting him fall, but preparing to expose the full, unvarnished truth. Every desperate lie he uttered was just another nail in his coffin, and I was watching, waiting, my evidence meticulously gathered, for the opportune moment to hammer them all in. The quiet revolution had begun, and it felt terrifyingly, exhilaratingly right. Those weeks, Reddit, after I'd pulled the plug and the first few collection notices started landing at my in-laws' perfect doorstep, they were a strange kind of purgatory. On the one hand, there was this grim satisfaction, a cold sense of justice finally being served. Watching Oscar squirm, seeing the panic flicker in his eyes when his Emil handed him another official-looking envelope, was like a twisted balm to the wounds he'd inflicted. My stomach, which had been in knots for months, felt a tiny bit lighter, a fraction less clenched. But then, the doubt would creep in, insidious and unwelcome, especially in the quiet hours after the bakery closed or when I was kneading dough. The rhythmic motion usually so soothing, but now just a backdrop for my churning thoughts. My hands would ache, not just from the work, but from the emotional tension. I'd stare at the flour dusting my apron, wondering if I was truly doing the right thing. The gnawing fear was always there, a constant hum beneath my resolve, my in-laws. I knew, with a chilling certainty, how they would react when the full truth finally exploded. They would panic, of course. Their carefully constructed world, where their son was a shining example of success, would shatter. And then, inevitably, they would blame me. I could already hear my MIL's voice, sharp with indignation. "Patricia, how could you abandon family? How could you let this happen to Oscar? You should have kept helping him. Don't you care about our image?" Her face, usually so composed, would crumple, and the tears would flow, not for Oscar's actual struggles, but for the devastating blow to their social standing. My FIL would probably go quiet, his disappointment a palpable, heavy thing in the room, his eyes accusing. They would see me as the villain, the one who broke the unspoken rule of keeping up appearances, the one who shattered their precious illusion. And my husband. He'd be caught in the middle, torn, and I knew that would tear at me. The thought of being the cause of such an upheaval in his family, of being painted as the heartless one, made my chest tighten, a familiar ache returning to my ribs. I'd replay Oscar's sneering words at dinner, the way his eyes had glinted with malice, the crushing silence of the table, my husband's silent plea. And then I'd remember Oscar's casual, entitled request for another little favor, just moments later, as if my generosity was an endless wellspring he was entitled to. It wasn't just about money anymore, Reddit. It was about dignity. It was about being seen, truly seen, not just as the little baker who could be dismissed and used, but as a person with boundaries, with pride. The main obstacle, the thing that kept me from second-guessing myself too much, was the absolute need to ensure that when everything inevitably surfaced, the full story came out. Not just the part where I stopped helping, making me look like the cruel, unsupportive SL. No, the whole ugly truth. How I had been helping, silently, sacrificially, for months, only to be publicly humiliated and then brazenly asked for more. This wasn't just about getting even. It was about ensuring that I wouldn't be scapegoated, that the blame would land squarely where it belonged. That's why I was so meticulous, almost obsessive with my evidence. Every single receipt of payments, every peso transferred from my bakery account to his credit card arrears, every desperate message from him. "Pat, please, this is urgent. I'm counting on you. My bank account is frozen. I need this to clear." Every written agreement, however flimsy, where he promised to repay me next month. I had them all, neatly organized in a folder in my office, a physical manifestation of his lies and my silent burden. The stack of papers felt heavy in my hands, a tangible record of my quiet sacrifice and his blatant disrespect. I knew this proof was essential, not just for my own peace of mind, but to stand firm against the inevitable accusations. It was my shield, my sword, my truth. But still, the questions nagged at me, echoing in the silence of my small kitchen as I proofed dough for the morning. Was I doing the right thing? Was it worth breaking the family peace, the illusion that had been so carefully maintained for decades, for the sake of justice and my own dignity? My husband valued that peace above all else, and I knew how much this would hurt him, how much it would expose the fragile foundations of his family. Was I overreacting to an insult, however cruel? Should I have just swallowed it, as I always had, and kept quietly bailing Oscar out, just to keep the calm, to keep the illusion intact? The thought of that path made my stomach churn with disgust, but the alternative felt like igniting a powder keg. My principles were screaming, demanding to be heard, But the potential fallout, the emotional cost, felt immense. It was a constant battle in my head, a tug-of-war between my burning need for self-respect and the ingrained habit of playing the silent, supportive family member. Every morning, I'd wake up with a knot in my stomach, unsure if I was a hero or an asshole. But I knew one thing for sure. The train had left the station, and there was no turning back now. The weeks of gnawing doubt, the constant internal battle between my principles and the fear of shattering my husband's fragile family peace, finally culminated in another one of those mandatory Sunday lunches. This time, it was at my MILs again, of course. The air was thick with the usual blend of expensive perfume, slow-roasted lamb, and the unspoken tension that had permeated every gathering since Oscar's administrative errors started arriving in official envelopes. Everyone was trying to act normal, but there was an underlying current of anxiety, a nervous edge to the laughter. My MIL kept shooting worried glances at Oscar, who, despite the growing pile of debt notices, was still trying to project an air of nonchalant success. He still had his gleaming Mercedes parked ostentatiously outside, a defiant symbol of his failing charade. My folder, filled with all the receipts and messages, felt like a lead weight in my handbag, which I'd placed carefully beside my chair, almost within arm's reach. The meal was halfway through, the usual boisterous conversations about politics and market fluctuations filling the elegant dining room. Oscar, emboldened by a few sips of expensive wine, probably purchased on credit, I bitterly mused, leaned back in his chair, a familiar smirk playing on his lips. He was holding forth about some new investment opportunity he was exploring, his voice loud and confident. Then, his gaze, sharp and dismissive, landed on me. "You know, Patricia," he began, a condescending lilt to his voice, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's really quite something, isn't it? How some people are content with just making things, with their hands, while others are out there, truly building empires, shaping the future. It's a different mindset, I suppose. Not everyone is cut out for the big leagues, right? Some of us just stick to our little bakeries." He punctuated the jab with a patronizing chuckle, glancing around the table, seeking complicity. My SL, of course, offered a thin, knowing smile. My face, once again, felt hot with a familiar flush, a searing heat that prickled my skin. My hands, which I'd been resting on my lap, clenched into tight fists, my nails digging into my palms. My husband, sitting beside me, stiffened, but true to form. He didn't say a word, just stared intently at his plate. The familiar silence, the unspoken agreement to let his insults slide, began to settle over the table. But this time, it was different. This time, I was ready. Just as the uncomfortable chuckles began to fade, a sudden, sharp knock echoed from the front door, cutting through the strained atmosphere like a knife. Everyone paused, forks hovering midair, eyes wide with surprise. My MIL frowned, perplexed. "Who on earth could that be?" she murmured, clearly annoyed by the interruption. The maid, looking equally bewildered, went to answer it. A moment later, a tall, impeccably dressed man in a crisp blue uniform stood at the entrance to the dining room, holding a slim, official-looking document in a red folder. He scanned the room, his gaze settling directly on Oscar. "Mr. Oscar Solis," he announced, his voice formal and clear, loud enough to stop all conversation dead. "Delivery for you. Legal notice. Please sign here." A collective gasp went around the table. My Miles' hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with dawning horror. Oscar, caught completely off guard, his face draining of all color, stammered, "Well, what? A legal notice? What is this nonsense?" He tried to laugh it off, a nervous, brittle sound that cracked in the quiet room. "Must be a mistake. I don't know what you're talking about." But his eyes, darting frantically around the room, betrayed his growing panic. He looked like a cornered animal. My Mills' carefully made-up face crumpled in an instant. The elegant composure she usually maintained shattered, replaced by a raw, naked fear. "Oscar, what is this? What have you done?" she cried, her voice trembling. My FIL, usually so stoic, pushed back his chair with a loud scrape, his jaw tight, staring at his son with a mixture of disbelief and fury. This was it. My heart, which had been a frantic bird in my chest, suddenly felt calm, steady. I reached for my handbag, my fingers closing around the familiar worn leather of the folder inside. I pulled it out, slowly, deliberately, the crisp edges of the papers whispering as I extracted it. It felt surprisingly light in my hands, despite the weight of all the truth it contained. My husband, sitting next to me, finally looked at me, his eyes wide, a silent question in their depths. He saw the folder, and a dawning realization mixed with dread spread across his face. I met his gaze, a quiet, resolute message passing between us. I didn't need to say anything. He understood. He finally understood what I had been bearing, and what was about to happen. I pushed the folder across the polished table towards him. "Juan," I said, my voice clear and even, cutting through the rising murmurs and Oscar's desperate protests. "Perhaps you should read this. For everyone." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes still locked on mine, a silent battle playing out in his expression. Then, with a deep, shaky breath, he took the folder. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing the meticulously organized stack of documents. The first few pages were copies of bank statements, showing the direct payments I had made to Oscar's various credit card accounts. Then came the printouts of desperate WhatsApp messages from Oscar, begging for "just this one last favor, Pat," promising to repay me "next month, I swear." And then the written agreement, signed by him, acknowledging the debts and the repayment schedule, a schedule he had, of course, never honored. Juan started to read, his voice low at first, then gaining strength, each word a hammer blow against Oscar's carefully constructed facade. He read out the dates, the amounts, the specific names of the banks, the interest rates I'd been covering. He read Oscar's pathetic pleas, his feigned gratitude, his casual dismissals. Each sentence landed with the force of a confession. The silence that followed was absolute. A stunned, suffocating silence. My Maya let out a small, choked sob, her hands covering her face, her perfect world crumbling. My Fiel slumped back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Oscar, a look of utter betrayal and shame etched onto his face. Oscar himself stood frozen, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and utter terror, as if he couldn't believe his secret had finally been laid bare. The golden boy, exposed as a charlatan, a beggar himself, dependent on the little Beggar he'd so disdainfully mocked. The irony was palpable, thick in the air, a bitter truth everyone now had to swallow. The aftermath, read it, was exactly as I'd predicted, and yet somehow even more satisfying. My in-laws' image of their successful son was utterly shattered. The realization that the person they'd consistently looked down on, the woman who just sold bread and cakes, had been silently protecting their precious family image from ruin for months, hit them hard. There were tears, accusations, frantic phone calls, and eventually, a grudging, almost fearful respect directed my way. No more subtle digs about my little hobby. No more condescending glances. They saw me now, not as a guest barely making it into their esteemed social circle, but as the quiet force who had held their son's crumbling life together, and then, with chilling resolve, let it fall. Oscar? Oh, Oscar crashed and burned beautifully. Once the banks realized he had no one to bail him out and no genuine assets, his credit dried up faster than water in the desert. They refused extensions. They called in the debts. They even started proceedings to seize his property. He had to sell his beloved Mercedes, the symbol of his fake prosperity, and move into a much smaller rented apartment across town. His big deals evaporated. His connections suddenly became unavailable. The whispers started, of course, about his true financial situation, and his social standing, once so lofty, plummeted. He was no longer the golden boy. He was the cautionary tale. He stopped showing up at family asados for a while, too ashamed to face the music, or perhaps just too busy trying to piece his broken life back together. And me? I stopped being the beggar and became the woman everyone treated with a nervous kind of respect. The whispers about my little bakery were replaced with comments about my business acumen and strength. My Sil, bless her passive-aggressive heart, now compliments my cookies with genuine enthusiasm. My MIL even asked for my advice on managing some household bills the other day. It's wild, truly, the shift in dynamic. My personal realization through all of this is that keeping the peace sometimes means swallowing insults, enduring indignities, and sacrificing your own comfort for others. But some people, like Oscar, only understand consequences, not kindness. My quiet generosity was only enabling his arrogance and recklessness. The day I stopped paying his debts was the day he finally started paying for his own arrogance, and the day I finally stopped feeling like a guest, an outsider, in my own family. I finally felt like I belonged, on my own terms, respected for who I am and what I've built, not tolerated despite it. So Reddit, after all of this, after the humiliation, the silent sacrifice, the brutal exposure, and the fallout that followed, was I the asshole for letting him crash and burn? Or did I finally do what needed to be done? I really need an outside perspective.